And I believe that if we were to help more clinics, let's just call it health, wellness, fitness, coaching revenue streams on the back end or in addition to the front end services, that we're going to do a couple different things. We're going to finally fix the business model that is so time dependent that it is very hard to become profitable. Kick it.
Welcome to Strata Stories. My name is Thomas Schreiber. I'm the Director of Marketing here at Strata PT. Strata PT combines your EMR and billing into one automated system to increase revenue and achieve a 99.99% reimbursement rate for physical, occupational, and speech therapy clinics. On today's episode, Paul Singh, CEO of Strata PT, sits down with Frank Benedetto, founder of the Honey Badger Project, to discuss key strategies for physical therapists and practice owners. They dive into the role of physical therapists in addressing the chronic disease epidemic in the US, how new grads and business owners can innovate and implement time leverage strategies for growth, applying Y Combinator principles to build a practice that truly meets patient needs, and lastly, strategies to maximize the lifetime value of each patient. If you'd like to learn more about Strata PT and see how our EMR and billing works, head over to stratapt.com to book a demo. Now, without further delay, here's today's episode.
You know, it's one of those things where I think it's so fascinating to me that in the health world, the healthcare world, these practice owners, you know, somewhere along the way, they were sort of taught like, hey, you got your DPT or you became a PT and now you just got to set up your shingle and magically people will start showing up and ... there will be profit. And then, but then the reality is far different. And I think, you know, there's something to be said about the fact that, you know, typically in the tech world, we say that the best products don't win. The best distributed products or the best marketed products tend to win. And that's kind of also, I think in my limited experience, something that, you know, kind of applies here too. So, all right. So I got a couple of things I wanted to talk about. Let's see what triggers you. First off, your website is very fascinating to me. First of all, great name. We are Honey Badgers. I gotta hear the story on why, where that came from. But we're gonna put a link to your show note, to your website in the show notes here. But I will just say, the first time I clicked through from your LinkedIn profile, the headline over here says, "A healthcare business incubator," and I don't know if you want to go down this path and talk about this. I gotta say, this really caught my attention because coming from the venture capital world, this is like something we learned as an industry like 15 years ago. I little aside, I do a lot of tech investing. So about 200 new companies a year, that sort of thing. And one of the things we learned about 15 years ago, and I say we to make it sound bigger, my wife and I learned as we were doing this, was that in the tech sector at that time, capital was getting easier and easier to get, although founders didn't believe that. They always believe there's not enough money available. But what we kind of realized about 15, 16 years ago was that the functional the functional skills of entrepreneurship in the tech sector were not as common as we thought they should be. And so we created what we called an accelerator program, where it was really built around this 12-week program for tech startups. You know, now that's a pretty common thing in the tech world, but back then it was basically us, Y Combinator, and Techstars that was doing that. And I think by and large, it's proven itself to work pretty well in that world. So when I saw your website, I'm like, man, this is interesting. Like, I don't even know what, at the time I was like, I don't even know what this is, but this is like what the healthcare world needs. Now that I've like rambled that out and there's a compliment buried in there somewhere, I am curious. We are Honey Badgers. Where did that come from? Like, what's the story there?
Yeah, I would love to dig into the incubator part too, because Y Combinator was my inspiration.
Okay, perfect. All right. I want to. That's exactly where I'd love to go. If you're up for it.
Start with the Honey Badgers because I think it's a tone setter.
Yeah.
But the preview of the Y Combinator part is I'm a tech wannabe. I was too old and had two kids by the time I realized I don't think I could apply to Y Combinator. So wonder if there's some way that I could create my own parallel version of this in the healthcare world. And but let me back up. Honey Badgers, 2019, I get to start my career over again. I had sold a 5-location clinic that I've been building from 2015 to 19. And it was like graduating from college all over again. I was like, okay, what do I want to do? Because I don't want to do that again. That was a heavy lift, and there was a lot of bumps and bruises learned along the way. It changed my life, yes, but I just sensed that there was a better way to do private practice. And my intuition was that it was through technology. And for everybody who doesn't know, I am a doctor of physical therapy. I had no background in technology, but I just happened to come across this one book about Y Combinator, and the notion of pairing the back then the bold prediction was the combination of hardware and software was going to change the world. And at that time, that was like a revolutionary thought, when I first came across this book. And I thought to myself, well, as physical therapists, we're the hardware. What would it look like if we were to combine our skill set, our hard skills as doctors of physical therapy, with software? And I just started tinkering and playing around and started to see if I could create a value proposition that wasn't directly connected to my time. And that was really the origin. Now, I'm gonna circle back to why the honey badger though. Where does that come into play? When I first started to try to teach this, well before the world locked down. So this is before that whole era made digital somewhat normal. People were terrified. When I would even use the word technology around healthcare providers, they would freak out. And there is a people prefer the misery that they know compared to any sort of unknown future, even if that unknown future carries great fruits with it. And the honey badger is known as the world's most fearless animal. It was made popular by a viral 2012 video that I was always obsessed with.
That's right.
And
Yeah.
I was like, you know what healthcare needs? Healthcare needs a spirit animal to stop being so goddamn afraid. And fear is what's holding this profession back from evolving, period. I don't care what, we could list all the different excuses and reasons. It all boils back down to fear. And the honey badger was meant to be sort of this playful branding around the spirit animal to inspire more healthcare providers to change.
Well, and by the way, I love the connection to YC. I've invested in a bunch of companies that came out of there as well. And so like love that. I wish there was more. I think it's kind of cool to see like, some of the tech influence hitting this industry. I think that, um, just as a quick, like maybe story that leads into this as well is that, uh, we've done one of the things that people don't understand that people don't one of the things that people don't understand about venture capital, for example, is that there's a very high failure rate. It's just how it goes, right? It's like it's not like normal work. It's like if I was a barista at Starbucks and I screwed up 9 out of 10 coffees, I probably wouldn't make it through the morning break before I got fired. But in venture capital, you're betting on, for example, 10 different early stage companies. You know full well that 9 of them might not work out, and that's okay. Everybody knows this. But when the 10th one hits, it hits big. And so when I think about what I've learned in the healthcare industry, and this is kind of a long story for a different time of like how I ended up here. Um, I think it's interesting. If you were to take a random set of 10 practice owners around the country and ask them whether they would do it again, I think publicly they'd all be like, yeah, absolutely. I love treating patients. Right. But like you've got the experience to like be able to say, no, like the reality is I don't want to do that again. Right. So the thing is like, I think most practice owners, if you asked them directly whether or not they would do it again, they would say the business sucks. I don't want to do it. But then what's interesting to me is on the other end of the spectrum, you see private equity firms coming in, rolling up, in some cases, hundreds of practices every quarter, because clearly the money is there. So it's interesting to me that, both of those statements can't be true. One side of the market can't say, oh my gosh, this is so unprofitable and horrible. And then the other side of the market on essentially the same day says, we love this. It's printing cash. We're buying it all up. And it leads me to this kind of conclusion personally that um, the reason why most practices are unprofitable and eventually, unfortunately, fail is very similar to why most companies in venture capital fail. We did some research on this internally because of our portfolio size. We've got the data. And what we found was that um, when companies fail, if you actually look in retrospect, you look at what the founders and what the founding team of these technical companies were doing in the days, weeks, and even months leading up to the ultimate failure. If I asked most people why they failed, they would say, well, we ran out of money. Now, you being a DPT, I think you'll probably get this more than most. The thing is, the problem and the symptom are usually very different. The problem is they ran out of money. The symptom is the interesting part from a venture capital standpoint. It turns out if you look at the historical Google calendars or any records they were keeping internally about what the founding team was doing, it turns out human behavior, human psychology plays a very big part of that failure. So for example, when we feel pain in the technical startup world, let's say you have a technical founder, just for the sake of simplicity here, when things aren't going right, when finances aren't balancing out, when money's coming down to the wire and maybe you got to go raise more money, even if you couldn't, most people psychologically back to or revert back to what they know best. In the case of technical founders, they write more code. They convince themselves that surely the reason why it's not working is because I didn't build the right feature or whatever. And so they go inwards when in fact we know that what they really ought to be doing is picking up the phone and calling 200 more people. I mean, 200 is a relative term, right? But when things are getting bad and difficult, you don't want to resort back to what you know. Rather, you want to refocus heavily on customer acquisition. I would assert that for most practices that are unprofitable, most PT practices that are unprofitable or failing, I would assert that there's something similar that's happening. They've been trained through their schooling and education to have devoted so much time and attention to this degree, to this training, rightfully so, by the way, right? Because we want these people, these medical professionals, to not hurt people. um, but then they go and they set up a practice and they do what they think is the hard thing, go get credentialed or go set up their cash pay, go do all these things, right? And then they like sit there and then they're wondering how to get more patients. And then they realize like, oh my gosh, patients aren't getting here. And now they start slashing and burning everything related to customer acquisition, or patient acquisition. And eventually it just kind of goes to zero. I guess the summary of my little ramble there, and I'm curious what you think, is that this is why I think without even knowing anything about your incubator, which I want to kind of talk about if you're open to it, this is why I think things like this need to exist. I was just talking to somebody else a week ago from my venture community, and out of the blue, I don't think anybody else would get this, but maybe you will. He said, like, what would you do if you had unlimited time? I was like, man, I think I would put like a $10-20 million fund together and I would recreate the accelerator program for healthcare. And he's like, well, but you've never run a practice. I was like, yeah, that's one of the problems actually. but I think there's something to it, right? Like, how do you actually run a venture style practice a venture style business model around healthcare practices? Maybe inject 50K, 100K in exchange for a little bit of equity, but with the condition being that they've got to join this 12-week or whatever accelerator program. We can get into the specifics of YC versus 500 and all that stuff, but there's something there because the business side of practice ownership is very rarely discussed in any reasonable way. So now that I rambled all that out, thoughts are welcome, but
yeah, you've just described my life's vision and my ultimate end goal for the Honey Badger project. Yeah, we should probably talk more. We should talk more about that. But I have a contrarian viewpoint though. So there's one part of that I want to disagree with like heavily, and the thing that I keep seeing is that we think more client acquisition is actually the solution, and it's that the actual business model is fundamentally broken. So when I sold my practice, it was profitable, but it sucked. It sucked to run it. It was hard to run it. It was a heavy load. We needed more and more client acquisition. We needed, the margins grew thin in the messy middle. You get to $1 to $3 million, and it's tough to break out of it. But then you break out of it, and it's a completely different area.
By the way, we're not disagreeing at all. I think you're right, but I'll let you finish your thought there.
So the concept that I see people trying to solve if they're not profitable, they just try to cram more patients in, as opposed to leaning on readily available technology, because the amount of apps out there that have been built to house expert knowledge and deploy that in new and interesting ways, there's no shortage, and they're all affordable. We're talking like less than $100 a month.
That's fair. Yeah. And again, like, I can't stress enough, like, I don't think we're actually in disagreement. I think you're not wrong. I would say, okay, so I'll make an assertion that I think that the general understanding of how to run a physical therapy practice today in 2025, I would say by and large looks like what we thought or how little we knew as an industry about how you run an e-commerce company in 2002. Meaning, like, nobody back then knew what is a cohort analysis, what is what is cost of acquisition? What is the lifetime value of a customer? Nobody ever knew that. And then over the course of a decade or two, the venture community and the broader like technology startup world started to kind of like get more sophisticated. So it's to the point now where if I were to call, let's just say right after this call, we called one of the founders of my e-commerce investments. I guarantee you that if I were to call unannounced and say, "Hey, what was the cost of acquisition of last week's new customers?" they could riff it to you right away because they know it. That being said, I don't think it's going to take 20 years for the healthcare practice or healthcare world to get there.
If you had called a random practice owner, they'd say, "Do you mean lunch last week? The lunch the lunch and learn that I paid for last week? Is that what you mean?"
Yeah. I was like telling this story to somebody else the other day. I was like, so I do a lot of running. It's like cheaper than therapy. It's the only thing Indian people are good at, I think, is like running and spelling bees, maybe. Um, but statistically, I'm an idiot and I need to go see my PT like twice a year usually, right? And so I was actually seeing him like 3 months ago, 4 months ago, and out of the blue, you know, I don't like to talk work at the practice, which I know my team probably hates, but like I'm not gonna like the guy doesn't use us yet, right? But the point is I was like, "Hey man, do you know I'm worth like $1,200 a year to you?" And he was like, "What are you talking about?" I was like, "Man, I drop like $1,200 a year here." And he's like, "No, you don't. Your copay is like $20." I'm not making fun of the guy, which is why I'm not naming him right now, but it just speaks to the lack of understanding of like concepts like this. To your point, that maybe more patients aren't the right answer yet. Maybe the answer is understanding how much value an existing patient provides and making sure you get it. So he goes on to say, like, "What are you talking about? Your copay's $20 or whatever." I'm like, "Yeah, but I'm an idiot, and I also read my EOBs. I know that you're eventually getting about $100." But I went on to say, I said, "What's wild to me is that not that you don't know that number. What's wild to me, actually, in this moment, I said, was that the real estate agent that I've used 3 times over the course of 15 years markets to me as a consumer more than you do."
You're not going to believe the timing of this. Right before this call started, my realtor just said Dunkin' Donuts coffee giveaway on the 14th from 9 to 10:30. Show this picture at Dunkin' Donuts, and it was 3 years ago that I used her last.
That's right. And so like I don't. That's again the reason I'm not naming it is because I don't want to like shame people. I just see so much opportunity here.
I want to really drive this point home is we are so far behind on the business fundamentals in this profession that even the notion of the most infantile innovation gets stifled. So what I'm advocating for, what we're talking about is the basics, right? Lifetime value. So and there's a big movement and a push to basically just get these basics, like what is cost of acquisition, what is lifetime value, what do these terms even mean, how do I understand them in my business, which is preventing innovation from occurring. And even if we were to get caught up and just have sound business basics, the point that's being missed is that the business model is fundamentally broken. And I'll give like a really clear what's Frank, what's your solution? Most of your following, if I understand correctly, is insurance-based clinics. What percentage of them have a discharge program where you don't actually need to leave their ecosystem, but we're using some form of technology to keep the lifetime value going in a way that is in service of the client? This is instantly available to every practice owner, and the percentage of clinics, insurance-based clinics in particular, that have any sort of time leveraged or digital centric, tech centric revenue stream is in the single digit percentages or less.
Oh yeah. I agree. I think yeah. Well, actually, sorry. Finish your thought. I don't want to interrupt.
Yeah. So what I'm calling for is that we cannot just call for clinicians to get caught up into the business basics, but we need to almost precede that they need to learn the business basics to evolve and start using technology in very easy to use technology in ways that could create time leveraged products within their ecosystem that is not just insurance reimbursement for a session, reimbursement for a session, and then thinking that the only evolution is cash then for a session. Okay, insurance is no longer covering. they most practice owners think that just charging a cash amount for a session is some form of innovation. It's not, just a change of monetization strategy. And when you apply readily available technology, we can create revenue streams where it's actually more affordable for the end user to stay involved in the ecosystem, creates a meaningful revenue stream, while also staying in touch with people more naturally to reactivate them in your primary revenue stream.
I I don't disagree with anything you're saying there, by the way. I think that okay, so I'm going to say this probably very inarticulately, but whatever. Everybody knows I'm like a second grader. But I think here's the thing. Like, first things first, I wish more practice owners saw themselves as patient acquisition companies that happen to provide healthcare. And what I mean by that is, like, let's use the example of Instacart. I don't know if that's something you've used in the past. Maybe that's an example people will understand when they listen or watch this. Um, Instacart, once you actually begin to use it, it is just so sticky because it makes your life so much easier that, like, they're just retaining you in there, like, right. But the interesting part of them is not the retention side. I mean, that's an important part of it, a huge part of their business model, of course. But the really interesting part is like how they acquire people like me initially. So, for example, they will try everything from, hey, here's $30 to off your first order, or your first two orders at Wegmans or Harris Teeter, right? Like, what they're trying to do is start the behavior in some way and then retain you because you're so in love with the value that you were provided, right? So, like, I admit fully that if we were to time travel back 5 years ago, and if you said to me 5 years ago, Paul, in 2025, you will have 4 kids and you will be one of those people that just rolls up to Wegmans and does not even get out of the car. You just hit the button and, like, they put your groceries in the back car. I'd be like, get out of here. Are you insane? That is ridiculous. But over time, like, I like going into the store with, I love my kids to death, by the way. They're awesome. But going into the store with the kids is easily a 90-minute affair, even if I just need a gallon of milk, right? So the point is, though, is that, like, back to practices for a moment, whether they come in via cash pay, whether they come in via insurance pay, I think I would say I wish more clinic owners stopped being romantic about the business they run and see themselves as, like, okay, and talk to themselves in the sense of, okay, how do I initially acquire the patient? Maybe it's cash pay. Maybe it's through coaching a running club. I don't know. Maybe it's the insurance side of the business. But either way, once you start getting serious about lifetime value of a customer, you start to force yourself to think slightly differently. Like uh, my guy that I see, like, I think could be so much more successful, but I think he's really happy with his practice, and that's okay. But the interesting thing about him is, like, I don't know if he does this on purpose. I remember last year, I had a little knee thing, and my plan of care called for like 6 or 7 visits or something like that. Between, like, COVID and a bunch of other stuff with my kids, I couldn't go in to see him for like the third, fourth, fifth visit or whatever, right? So one day he leaves me a voicemail, or sorry, he texts me, and he said, "Hey, that he saw on Facebook that I had just finished up the Marine Corps marathon or whatever," and he goes, yeah, that 337 you ran, I'm pretty sure, like, you're not going to run that again if you don't finish this plan of care. And afterwards, by the way, we should talk about what it's going to take to get you down to 325, which for runners, that's like cocaine, right? It's like, oh my God, what? Give me more of that. What is that? I'll pay money for that. So anyway, all I'm just saying is, in my poorly articulated way, I think you're right. Like, the way that you described it, I think, is a much more coherent way of thinking about it. And I'm just trying to say, I agree. Like, I think, like, I don't get to talk to very many people that understand the tech side. They don't understand, like, you understand the venture side of things. Like, one of my venture buddies was asking me the other day, he's like, what are you doing with Strata? What is this thing? You've been over there for a while. And I was like, I said to the guy, and maybe you'll get this. I don't think anybody outside of venture will get this. I said, I've invested in enough companies to, like, have been in a couple good exits, but in our industry, if you get $1 billion valuation or higher, we call you unicorns. Like, it's so rare that we literally call these tech companies unicorns. The healthcare industry, I mean, the amount of money that flows through just MSK, and you can like all the numbers nerds are gonna like crucify me here, right? But even if you just like lop off all the healthcare systems and you really just look at like SMB, clinic owners from like the solopreneur all the way up to like the practice that has 20 locations and whatever, the amount of dollars that flow through there, I think, present multiple $100 billion exits every year if they got serious about their businesses. And I think it's going to be a combination of what you and I are talking about. It's like getting serious about understanding that once you acquire patient Susie, you've got to not only help her get better, but you got to like make sure that everything you now provide to her afterwards is so compelling to her, so useful to her, that regardless of whether or not she has healthcare coverage for that, she's going to want to pay for it.
So a huge part of my why, I'm going to inject this story seemingly out of nowhere here, is my dad passing away at a very young age due to medical negligence over the course of decades with type 2 diabetes and heart disease. And the how this cross sections with what you just shared about the sheer size of the problem, right? That's what VCs love. Like, show me the problem, show me this problem, the size of the problem, show me the size of the market. You know what trumps MSK? Chronic disease. Do you know what is the gatekeeper to chronic disease? MSK.
Ah, interesting.
So
Yeah. I've heard this. Yes.
if
Yeah.
you find the if we I what phrase I say all the time is that musculoskeletal injuries are the gateway drug to chronic disease. And what's really interesting is that right around the same cross section, when people start getting more degenerative MSK issues or become a bit more prone to injuries and end up finding themselves in physical therapy clinics, is exactly the same time where pre-diabetes, the phase of life of pre-diabetes, pre-hypertension. And do you know what still today the standard treatment is? The first course of treatment when somebody gets diagnosed with pre-diabetes or pre-hypertension?
What is it?
A pamphlet that outlines the lifestyle behavior change in quotes, or to change. And if you don't improve in 6 months, come back and we're going to start the meds. And what part here, I'm going to loop this all together. Ready? I believe that the future of the MSK field is creating time leveraged back end revenue streams that directly intervene upon the chronic diseases that are actually the main dragging down of the US economy as it relates to healthcare spending, and is currently completely out of control with no end in sight. And I believe that if we were to help more clinics insert, let's just call it health, wellness, fitness, coaching revenue streams on the back end or in addition to the front end services, that we're going to do a couple different things. We're going to finally fix the business model that is so time dependent that it is very hard to become profitable. So we time leverage, and all of a sudden we create some space in the profit margins. With that space, we pull the founder out to start working on the business, not in the business. Cliche because it's true. And so few clinicians ever get that privilege to work on their business. So the key is, without having to blow up the front end of your business, because a lot of times when insurance-based owners hear me, they're like, "Well, I'm running on 10% margins right now. I can't take the risk of doing anything risky on the front end." You don't have to. Let's position this on the back end, because you're just letting your clients discharge away. It is ridiculous that you didn't finish your 3 out of 6 visits. It's what we're talking about. That's the business basics. You should have finished your 3 out of 6 and then stayed on. And it sounds like your particular clinician has some interest in run coaching or some sort of fitness that, pitched the right way, you would have been on a monthly recurring revenue, some sort of product. And now you stay in the ecosystem. And now, not only in the ecosystem, you get reactivated to the primary revenue streams more often in a meaningful way, not in a dependency way.
Yeah, I mean, this is what we generally call the flywheel model. Is like, it's not, you're not just like bringing a patient in and then like churning them, or like even in the e-commerce world, right? Like everybody in the e-commerce world knows that if you acquire a customer and get them to buy something for you from the first time, that's cool, but it's a bloodbath at that point because you got to constantly keep acquiring new customers. So really what you got to do is think about it from a flywheel standpoint. What is the initial reason that somebody buys? And then how do we then make sure that they're coming, that we're adding so much value that or products or whatever that they want to replenish or get more from us or whatever. It's kind of, and again, what we're talking about in the healthcare industry is unique because a lot of practice owners don't yet think this way. But I would argue that even your local grocery store is thinking this way. I mean, like there's a Harris Teeter.
Everyone else is thinking
Exactly. That's exactly right. Like it's like when I check out at Harris Teeter, the local grocery store outside my neighborhood here. There's a reason why every cashier at the checkout says, "Did you find everything you need?" It's not because they're being nice. That's not why they train all these 16-year-olds to say it. They say it because if on the off chance there was something I couldn't find, that's an additional $9 on the receipt, or maybe another $5 on the receipt, and everything adds. Every addition, they already marketed the hell out of it to get me to show up, and they're paying this massive lease to the landlord of that facility to put that place right outside here, right? So now it's like I'm already in there. Every incremental dollar of additional spend is just pure profit at that point, essentially, right? So I think it's unsexy to talk about in this industry yet. But okay, so you can take a pass on this if you want, but I'm curious. Can you tell us more about this incubator? I'm curious about what that looks like.
Let's reverse 2019. A less gray bearded Frank, still a little more pepper than salt, says, "Oh man, like I just wish I could go to Y Combinator and bring some of these ideas." And then I get the dose of reality.
Hey, they're overrated. You got to come to mine instead. But go ahead.
Deal. What's the name of yours?
The venture firm is 500 global, 500 startups.
Got it. Talk about doing my research before the podcast, right? There's a
look, you can't, right? Paul Singh is like the Steve Smith of India. There's like a billion of me. ChatGPT wouldn't even tell you which one I am anyway. So so don't feel bad.
Thanks for making me feel better. So 2019, Frank starts daydreaming like, oh, I can't go there. Is there something like this that's healthcare specific? And I find nothing. And I thought to myself, what would it take to create one myself? And the first answer to that was a lot more money than I could potentially actually look inside my own capital and say that I had. So I needed to come up with some sort of way to build myself to an incubator in the truest Silicon Valley sense, which for people who are listening who might not know, which the truest expression of that is that it includes a capital injection along with advisory and at this early stage. So what I actually started to devise over a course of several years was a front-end monetized incubator where think of it as just a giant funnel. And my mission is that our free content alone drives innovation in healthcare. I hope someone listens to this and actually sits down with a pen and paper sometime this weekend and says, okay, I'm going to do this. So how are we going to install some sort of back-end leverage revenue stream? Do something. So free content, getting clinicians thinking differently. Then entry level, I'll take you through what the future pacing is. I got stuck getting clinicians to think differently because so many of them are so incredibly burnt out. That the notion of innovation is such a higher energy level than most people who are stuck in survival mode can even fathom. That they're like, I'm not talking about innovation, rescue me, right? That's actually the state of the majority of healthcare. So imagine free content gets people thinking differently. Then an entry level personal performance. Let's get healthcare providers addressing their burnout. Let's get healthcare providers addressing their time management to create the space to actually start a business. Next level down, let's have a program where employees can come and start innovative businesses right off the jump. Because the sad reality, Paul, is that the majority of people listening to this podcast, hopefully some of you get pissed off enough to say, F you, Frank, like, I'm going to prove you wrong. They will listen to this, love the mental stimulation of it, and go back to their day-to-day and rationalize staying the same until they retire and die. So I realized through trial and error that the actual best market to get to adopt a newer age way of thinking was the new grad market and people who have not yet gone into business. It's so much easier to get them to launch a hybrid or time leveraged business model off the jump because they don't have to fix anything. They just need to start. And then I've created an ascension ladder where they can grow. Now, at the very bottom of this is a true incubator, and we did make our first investment. So we're at the very beginning phase of this. It's digital health for the trucking industry. It's called Offshift. It's a BDE model. And Mark came through our program, as a student physical therapist, attracted to our message that we got to start doing this differently. Thought he was going to build a little tiny practice inside of a gym working with barbell athletes. Went through the training I urged innovation. I continually urge innovation. Let's think differently. Let's think differently. Had a handful of truck drivers all come in to this one practice and said, "Oh my God, these people are neglected." Did some research, found that they die an average of 16 years younger than the rest of the population because of their job. Meanwhile, every single thing in our world touches a truck still, and will do so for decades and decades to come. So he digs in deeper. These people are riddled with chronic disease. It says, "This is what I want to solve." He's the type of founder who's going to live in parents' basement until he figures it out, and then starts making all sorts of connections because of how niched down he got. Getting introductions to the former president of UPS, getting introductions to the United States Postal Service division that's oversees the wellness programs. And I recognize that that's 0.00001% of healthcare is willing to do that. So what I'm trying to do, instead of just trying to find them, I'm trying to create them. I am trying to get exposure to students at the student level and give them free information that they can't unsee, so that when they go to their clinical rotations and they go to some shit factory style clinic, they go, "I can't do this. This is not how I'm going to start my career. I refuse." And then they use our methodology to build something innovative. If we need an army of those to just change healthcare at scale, but a tiny percentage of those is going to get the bug that's thinking more societally.
Yeah.
And my goal is to create so my decades long plan is to create a fund and investor match, or the different ways to potentially
Yeah.
structure this.
Yeah.
Create a place where innovation can be cultivated. And lastly, here is because in the rest of the world, like YC, your incubator, there's already this like magnet, right? The venture capital world exists in the rest of the world independently. The only VC world that exists inside healthcare is just these roll-ups that have nothing to do with anything other than volume for insurance-based negotiating power, period. And I sold one of my locations to somebody like that. So I've committed the sin where I basically sold a really successful practice to at the time it was 100 location practice, and they were on their marching orders to get to 3 to 500, because when they do, they have different terms with insurance companies, and that's the entire value proposition. That's the only way VC exists in healthcare right now. It's scaled at large.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I don't disagree. Slight nomenclature thing, though. I would say venture capital doesn't really exist in this industry. It's big brother or big sister called private equity. Two sides of the same coin, but private equity, to put it in the simplest terms, I think private equity is really more about at scale, like rolling up things that are already working, jamming them together, getting higher EBITDA and profit margins. It's a different part of the ecosystem. But I think on the earlier stage side, I don't think there's any venture capital firm yet in this industry. And I would go so far as to say, like, I don't think there's really any good training yet. I mean, obviously, like what you're doing is there and all that. And until I started preparing for this call, I was like, oh, this is cool. Like, I didn't even, as soon as I saw the website, I'm like, oh, well, this is interesting. Let's figure out if he wants to be on the show. That being said, though, I just think there's a big opportunity here. And I think, you know, there's a line, I'm probably going to date myself here a little bit, but like 25 years ago in the first Gladiator movie, there was a line that he says, where he says, if whoever controls the crowd will control their freedom. And that little simple phrase has proven itself to be true time and time again in almost every industry. People don't realize that, like, the world is not driven by the normal distribution. It's not like, oh, let's grade on a curve at grade school because, we can't have little Timmy failing. So let's just curve everybody forward. The world is primarily driven, even the non-venture capital world, the world is driven by the power law distribution. The top three most well-known players, providers, businesses, whatever, in any industry usually control like 80% of the dollars and the mind share and everything. And so really, like, as we think about it, when we think about like I admit, by the way, the venture world is probably not the venture world also has its flaws, right? We probably don't fund enough people as an industry. We probably are too whatever. So there's definitely some flaws there. But it's hard to argue the fact that like when like some of the biggest wins that have come out of the venture community over the last 25 years, predominantly in the tech sector, have gone on to create trillions of dollars of value and jobs and things like that. So I, I guess what I'm just trying to say is like I think there's something very, very interesting here, and I think that again again only knowing what I've learned about your incubator so far, I think here's the little dirty secret. Um, it, if I had a time machine, I can go back and tell myself, talk to myself 15 years ago when we first started like building the venture capital firm and doing all this like accelerator stuff. I would say this. I would say everybody's going to have you believe that your ability to have access to cash, good judgment, and deal flow is going to determine whether or not this incubator idea is going to work. I would argue, with my little lens of my little world, I would argue that knowing what I know now, those are table stakes, but they are not the thing that determine whether or not an accelerator wins or not. I'll use Y Combinator as an example. YC at this point has hundreds of competitors, hundreds of competitive programs around the world. It's easy to get diluted into the thought that, gosh, because they have so much money now and because they have so much good judgment on their team and whatever deal flow, that's why they're dominant. That's not true. It's actually access to the deals. If you look back to the beginning of 500, the beginning of Y Combinator, even the beginning of Techstars, frankly, the beginning of any successful business, I would say that it's access to the first customers, access to the first investable businesses that were willing to let you take the bet, and then all these other things are important. Don't get me wrong. Like if you have access to crap deals, then no amount of judgment's going to fix that. Right. So, I would say like, I think those principles still apply here. It's like, and a lot of practice owners listening to this are not going to like what I have to say here, but in the context of venture thinking that we're talking about here, the big question is like, if we could find 3 practices doing, let's call it 100 visits a week. Actually, let's bring it down. Let's say 3 practices somewhere in the country that are doing 50 visits a week. It's that you're still in the owner operator kind of realm, probably. If there was a way to like invest a tiny bit in, because you don't want control of the business, but you want to have some skin in the game, because now you can kind of influence what they have to say and now, or what they're going to do, these practice owners. And now you start to think about this idea of like, hey, we're going to create like let's call it a 12-week program. And on the end of this 12-week program, one of the 3 that improves the most might have an additional 300 grand or something available to them. And you have to, the point is though, is that like, not only does that now force competition and force the training to happen and all these things, but now you've got a winner. You don't have 2 losers at the end, by the way. You have just 3 companies that have now probably improved in some demonstrable way. And now it becomes the flywheel of like other practice owners that now that want that same dream are now starting to compete. So it's like, if you think about it now, the allure of YC, and I just use YC because you know them, right? The allure of YC is that every aspiring technical founder on the planet aspires to be part of the YC network. And, going back to problem and symptom, right? You have to almost like ignore what everybody thinks of YC now and almost time travel back and ask, what was it like back then? And if you look at Paul Graham's original essays, the earliest essays, they're still published online. You can see that like the way YC emerged from the way he thought about, investing his time and his wife's time and money into promising founders. What we see now is really just the institutional version of what Paul Graham was doing from the earliest days. He didn't have unlimited capital like he might have now, So anyway, there's a pep talk in there somewhere. But I do think, full disclosure for anybody listening, I don't have a business relationship with you and vice versa, right? But I do think there's something very, very fascinating about what you're working on. And it's one of those things where like, there's probably no one right way. You talk to probably 20 people, you're probably going to get 23 different suggestions on how to run your incubator. I would argue that, coming back to venture capital, you just have to have conviction, and then you're going to take a bet. I always tell people the hardest thing about venture capital, the hardest thing about investing in technology startups is being willing to look like an idiot for 2 years, and then really the hard part is trying not to be an asshole when all the numbers work out, a couple of years later. you know, that's the difficult part. Um,
I'm gonna jump all the way back into the middle of that. 'Cause I'm gonna nitpick something just because I want to bring it back to something that the clinicians listening to this, if they're sticking around as we nerd out on the VC world, visits per week. That still is if there is a dream, is that with the information that I'm trying to bring to the world, is that we set a new standard for what we're trying to achieve beyond visits per week, beyond your blended rate, beyond these basic metrics, and really start infusing. Because when you start looking at time leveraged delivery mechanisms, or you start looking at ancillary revenue streams that no longer hinge on the visits, but the totality of the worth of, let's say, that plan of care, or the lifetime value of the monthly recurring membership ongoing, all of a sudden the business owner could step back, and yes, visits per week will likely be one of just many stats, but instead of this gold standard. So if you're listening to this, just all I'm asking you to do is just take what we're talking about here, because I
yeah,
care so much about people actually doing
yeah,
something with this
yeah.
information. I hate when people use my viewpoint as infotainment. If you're a cash or insurance based owner and all you're doing is selling sessions, either through insurance reimbursement or your direct pay, it is time to innovate, and it can be easy. You can take the first step. There are apps you could download and use those apps to then charge your clients for continued access to you, your knowledge base, your programs, habits, in a way that changes fundamentally their lives, because I'm a mission driven person by nature. I don't believe in any of this stuff for the sake of business. I believe in conscious capitalism, and that we can inspire clinicians to start thinking differently about business as a force for good. But it takes being part of the 1% that's bold enough to say, I will no longer just sell sessions.
I don't disagree. I mean, look, I think any sort of um, any sort of improvement here, I think, is good for everybody. It's good for the patients, good for the clinicians, all that. Um, all right, so I want to be respectful of your time, by the way, but it sounds like we're going to have plenty to talk about on a second episode here. Um, since you're so familiar with Y Combinator, I think a fun story to maybe share with the group here, and might even be useful for you as well, with your the participants for your incubator. Are you familiar with like the legendary YC T-shirt? Does that ring a bell? Okay, so like one of the oldest stories, and this is not just a story. I mean, I've seen them too, but basically, in the earliest days when you got accepted into Y Combinator, I mean, that was a very hard thing to do. It's still very hard to do now. One of the things you were given as part of that, in addition to like the equity and all that stuff, you were given a T-shirt that that said "Make something people want." It literally says. I mean, people can Google this. If you Google it, the T-shirt says "Make something people want," and then if you go on to then successfully exit, essentially you turn in that T-shirt and you trade it for another one that said "I made something people wanted." And it's such a simple thing. And I think whether or not whether you and I agree on the specifics of what practices need to do is irrelevant. What we can agree on is that whether the goal is to exit your practice or the goal is to just print cash flow from your practice, like whatever the goal is, how you get there is the same, in the sense that you have to make something the patient wants. You do that, and all of a sudden the wallets open up, and it's almost like taboo to talk about that. I mean, the call that I was on before this was talking to practice owners that don't know how to stop missing out on copays. Like they're just so afraid of like, God, and I get it, right? They're like, what if Grandpa John says like $20 copay is not in the budget. What do? Do you turn them around? Do you not? Like it's a very difficult problem to have. But I, you know, I left that call saying like, look, I know it's not a simple solution, but imagine going to Starbucks, grabbing a cup of coffee and leaving. Ask yourself what happens then. Try to walk out of your grocery store with a gallon of milk. Ask what happens then. Somehow the balance of, what a patient might owe has shifted from the healthcare payer's problem to now the clinician's problem. And so, anyway, I'll leave it there. That's probably that's going to spark a firestorm probably there. So I'll stop now. But okay, so we'll get more into this in episode 2, I suppose, but around 2. But if people want to find you, what's the best way for them to do that? Like, what should we put in the show notes? Where should they reach out to you?
Yeah. So the most prolific platform I'm on is Instagram, Frank_Benedetto. We'll drop a link in there. And for our more advanced business owner content, especially if you're an insurance-based owner, LinkedIn is where to find the content that's really specific to how you could start innovating without blowing up your business. Because I understand that we've got to start small and prove that it's going to change your business, not just preach about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome, Frank. Well, this was a lot of fun. We probably didn't cover everything you want to cover, but I promise you we're gonna have to do a round 2 on this because I do think this is super, super interesting.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Strata Stories. Strata PT combines your EMR and billing into one automated system to increase revenue and achieve a 99.99% reimbursement rate for physical, occupational, and speech therapy clinics. If you'd like to learn more about Strata PT and see how our EMR and billing services work, head over to stratapt.com to book a demo.